This episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. It's hard to find time in the day to take care of your mental health, isn't it? We've all got 1,000 things to do, and most of the time there just aren't enough hours in the day to do them all. The thought of taking time out of our busy day to drive across town and visit a therapist can seem impossible. Luckily, BetterHelp is here to help. BetterHelp is customized online therapy that offers video, phone, and even live chat sessions with your therapist, so you don't have to see anyone on camera if you don't want to. It's much more affordable than in-person therapy, and you can start communicating with your therapist in under 48 hours. And thanks to the great people at BetterHelp, I have a special offer for Obscure History listeners. You can get 10% off your first month of professional therapy at betterhelp.com/obscure. That's betterhelp.com/obscure. Thanks again to BetterHelp for sponsoring this episode. Last week I told you about London's very own, very real, and very complicated Batman. He was a man by the name of Jonathan Wild, and despite being a professional vigilante, he was also a professional criminal. He expertly played both sides of the law and amassed a large fortune doing so. But such tenuous arrangements are bound to crumble eventually. My name is Josh, and this is Obscure History. Shortly after Jonathan Wild was born into a poor family in Wolverhampton, another boy was born into a poor family. But rather than being born into the English countryside, he was born in London's pulsing heart. Jack Sheppard was born in 1702 in London's Spitalfields. It is estimated that by 1700 some 2,000 houses accommodated a population of perhaps 15,000 in that area. It was a small chunk of a giant metropolis, housing people on top of people crammed into small rooms. In Sheppard's adolescence, the Spitalfields became a hub of textile trade and production. Just as Jonathan Wild was likely born with some sort of disfigurement or physical limitation, Jack Sheppard too was born with an unknown health condition. We can make this informed assumption because his parents, likely fearing he may not survive, had him baptized the day after he was born. Despite their fears, Jack did survive, and the Sheppard family would have 3 other children. Tragically, when Jack was 6, his father died, leaving his mother unable to care for him or his siblings. As such, he was sent to Mr. Garrett's school, which was a workhouse near St. Helens Bishopgate. He was immediately sent to work at a furniture shop as an apprentice. By age 10, he was working for a family friend, Mr. William Kneebone, a wool draper. Since his father's death, his mother had been employed by Mr. Kneebone, and it was Mr. Kneebone that taught Jack Sheppard to read and write. It was also Mr. Kneebone who sent young Jack to apprentice under Owen Wood, a local carpenter. It seems as if this job played into his talents, because in 1717 Jack signed a 7-year indenture to Mr. Wood. Jack Sheppard's life started out tragically. It nearly didn't even start at all, but in Mr. Wood's care, all seemed to be turning around. After the Great Fire of 1666, and with the exploding population, carpenters were desperately needed in the early 1700s. Jack Sheppard found himself less than 2 years away from being a master carpenter, a title which would ensure his access to steady work and a quality of life he could have only dreamt of as an orphaned kid scratching out meager existence in the streets. In addition to having a solid career lined up for himself, he was a popular local figure. Despite being a small man, he had the kind of practical strength one gets by being a laborer. He was a handsome man, just entering his 20s. He had wide eyes, clear skin, and a large grin that flashed quickly. And despite having a notable stutter, his quick wit and sense of humor won over the pubs. However, things didn't continue in this sort of linear trajectory. Being popular at the pubs made him want to go there frequently, and frequently visiting the pubs introduced him to some less than reputable characters. His pub of choice was the Black Lion, and it was at the Black Lion that, in his own words, he lost his innocence. According to Daniel Defoe, who is thought to have ghost-written Shepard's autobiography, the two vices that kept him coming back to the Black Lion specifically were the strong drinks and the affections of a sex worker named Elizabeth Lyon. The stronger that their relationship got, the less of a grip Shepard had on his regular, mundane life. Shepard eventually threw himself headfirst into a life of debauchery, and as such his carpentry career suffered. He began to lose work, and to make up the difference, Elizabeth Lyon offered an interesting alternative. She suggested that, perhaps, he start supplementing his income through unsavory means. It began small, stealing silver spoons from a pub while out on errands for Mr. Wood. He wasn't caught, or even suspected of the crime, which only emboldened him. He began stealing bigger and more valuable things. At first it was sort of a hobby, something he did when the opportunity presented itself, but after realizing that he could make legitimate money through illegitimate means, he became brazen and reckless. He started stealing from houses that he was doing carpentry work in. Eventually, he found that he was making enough money from theft that he could quit his carpentry job entirely, and that's just what he did. Less than 2 years before the end of his indenture was up. He and Elizabeth moved in together in a sort of unofficial marriage. The couple was briefly split up when Elizabeth was arrested and taken to St. Giles Roundhouse, where she was detained by a certain Mr. Brown. Sometimes in life, seemingly out of pure random chance, we find the things we are good at without even trying. And this was the case for Jack Shepard. You see, Mr. Brown refused to allow him to visit Elizabeth, and this rubbed Jack the wrong way. He couldn't just sit back and idly accept such a harsh fate. No, that simply wouldn't do at all. So, to resolve the problem on his own terms, Jack Shepard snuck into St. Giles Roundhouse and liberated his true love. They escaped together and returned home. And this would only be the first in a long list of prison escapes for Jack Shepard. Shortly after breaking Elizabeth out of jail, he organized a theft with his wife and his brother Tom. The three targeted Clare Market and were able to get away with their crimes without any further suspicion. However, a couple of months later, Tom Shepard was caught for stealing, and having already been caught and punished once for the crime, he feared the gallows. So, in a desperate bid to save his own life, he flipped on his brother Jack and confessed to the earlier theft. His plan worked as he spared his own life, and an arrest warrant was issued for Jack Shepard. And it is in this betrayal that the course of Shepard's life would be set. You see, just as with every other criminal in London at the time, Jack Shepard had a number of dealings with Mr. Jonathan Wild. So when the warrant came through for Jack, Jonathan Wild treated it like another business transaction. The thief-taker general called on some of his men to arrange a meeting with Jack, and they did just that. Under the guise of a rousing game of lawn darts, Jack Shepard met up with a man named James Sykes. Sykes was a petty theft, much like Shepard, so perhaps Shepard let his guard down for a moment, honor among thieves and all that. This would prove to be a grave mistake, as Sykes immediately turned Shepard into the authorities and claimed the standard reward for thief-taking. Shepard was sent to St. Giles Roundhouse, however this stay would only last 3 hours. He was housed on the top floor, but he broke through the timber ceiling and lowered himself to the ground with a rope fashioned from bedcloths. A crowd had gathered below him after hearing the very obvious sound of somebody breaking through the ceiling. Still wearing his irons, Shepard coolly joined the crowd. He distracted their attention by pointing to the shadows on the roof and shouting that he could see the escapee. And then, as they furiously searched, the master escape artist swiftly departed without arousing the least bit of curiosity. Not only had he defied law and order by committing a crime and then circumventing his punishment, he also defied the will of Mr. Jonathan Wild. You see, if a thief had been turned in, Wild's scheme depended upon that thief remaining in jail until he could bail them out, so he could in turn then blackmail them into committing various crimes on his behalf. With Shepard missing from the jail, it deprived Wild of a business opportunity, and that was something that he simply could not live with. This first escape would prove to be the first battle in a war between Shepard and Wild that would last until both of their deaths. But before we get into the grisly details and complex inner workings of London's criminal underground, we need to pay the bill, so hang tight for about 90 seconds and we will be right back. On May 19, 1724, Shepard was arrested for a second time, caught attempting to pick somebody's pocket. He was once again detained in St. Giles' Roundhouse. His stay would last slightly longer this time, however. After a couple of days, Elizabeth went to the jail to join her husband. In an act of apparent compassion, the jailers locked Elizabeth and Jack in the cell together. Shortly afterward, they slipped away into the night. They had filed through their manacles as well as a bar on their window and then made a bedsheet rope to climb down. The story was widely publicized, and just as is true for true crime publications of modern day, the retelling was highly sensationalized, and the media made sure to dramatize the petite stature of Jack Shepard and the shapely figure of his criminal bride. After his escape, two very important things began happening. First, Jack Shepard became a sort of folk hero. The people of London, especially those who weren't keen on authority, began to view Jack as a sort of blue-collar success story. A man who grew up in the impoverished alleys of London, who blazed his own trail to fame and fortune, even if it meant shrugging moral obligation in the process. And second, Jonathan Wild began taking even closer note of Jack Shepard. Realizing that he could be a very valuable asset to his loose association of thieves and bandits, Wild sought an audience with Shepard in hopes to bring him onto the crew. Shepard, however, refused and began working with his friend, Joseph Blueskin Blake, forming a tiny gang of their own. Once it was clear that Shepard wouldn't be an ally and would instead be direct competition, Jonathan Wild began to treat him as a foe. Getting Shepard arrested proved to be an easy task for Wild. You see, all along, Jack Shepard was using a fence to pawn his stolen goods. A fence named William Field. A certain William Field that happened to be the fence for Jonathan Wild's gang. Either willingly or under duress, Field flipped on Shepard and turned him in for attempting to pawn stolen property. This time his incarceration would be much more serious. In his previous crimes, the punishment would be corporal, perhaps a burn here or a few bruises there, but for this repeat offense, Shepard would be sentenced to death. This time he was sent to Newgate Prison rather than the old roundhouse that he had escaped from twice before with little effort. Though the setting was different, the result was the same. Jack Shepard got plenty of visitors as he was a popular local figure. Primarily, he was visited by his wife, Elizabeth Lyon, who, in addition to smuggling him women's clothing, made it a habit to flirt with the guards. Now, perhaps this seems a bit cruel, to flirt with her husband's captors while he's locked behind an iron door, but it was all part of their master plan. Every time there was a visitor that would come to see Jack, he would stand against the door and discreetly jimmy the bars until it seemed as if he could get one to break. The very day that the order for his execution arrived at Newgate Prison, Jack Shepard removed one of the bars on his door, while his wife hammed it up with the guards. He slipped on the contraband blouses and shawl, and then slipped away unscathed from Newgate, boarded the first ferry out of town. He settled in a warehouse in Westminster where he had stored stolen property in the past. After spending time with friends and family and keeping a low profile, Shepherd decided to venture back into London. Despite being a folk hero to a certain portion of the population, he was immediately being harassed by Wilde's gang and the police. While he was successful in avoiding Wilde and his men, he was not so successful in evading the police. He was captured on a warm September day and was taken to Newgate Prison yet again. And this time he was placed in a cell in the very center of the prison where he could undergo constant surveillance. He was also attached to over 300 pounds of iron by thick manacles and ankle chains. The authorities were certain that they had him dead to rights. His execution was all but assured. At least, that's what they thought. Next door, Shepherd's closest friend and accomplice, Blueskin Blake, was on trial after Jonathan Wilde flipped on him as well. During the trial, Blueskin asked that his death penalty be reduced as he had worked for Wilde as a thief previously. When Wilde objected and the judge refused the offer, Blueskin flipped a pocket knife out of his hands, lunged at Jonathan Wilde, and slashed his throat. Blood began soaking Wilde's clothes and then the floor of the courtroom. The courtroom that this mayhem was occurring in just happened to be directly next door to the prison that Shepherd was being detained in. The ensuing madness took eyes off of Shepherd, and he quickly set about his escape. He unlocked his handcuffs and removed the chains. Still encumbered by his leg irons, he attempted to climb up the chimney, but his path was blocked by an iron bar set into the brickwork. He removed the bar and used it to break through the ceiling into the red room above his cell. Still wearing his leg irons as night fell, he then broke through 6 barred doors into the prison chapel, then to the roof of Newgate, 60 feet above the ground. He went back down to his cell, got a blanket, and then back to the roof of the prison, and used the blanket to reach the roof of an adjacent house owned by Mr. William Bird. He broke into the Bird's house and went down the stairs and out into the street at around midnight, without disturbing the occupants, with his leg irons still attached. Escaping through the streets to the north and west, Shepherd hid in a cowshed in Tottenham. He remained there for days, attempting to convince somebody, anybody, to free him of his heavy leg weights. Eventually, he was able to bribe a shoemaker into releasing him from his shackles, and with that, Shepherd once again escaped death, just as it started to tighten its grip around him. After the excitement had died down from the attempted murder next door, the guards returned to find Shepherd missing. After conducting their investigation and tracing his steps, the authorities passed the story along to the press, and the public absolutely devoured the story. It was reported in one paper that the devil himself appeared in person to loosen Shepherd's chains so he could make his escape. His freedom would only last about 2 weeks, though. He once again decided to re-enter London, this time disguised as a beggar. He dropped the gimmick as soon as possible and broke into a pawn shop on Drury Lane. He took a black cloak, a silver sword, and diamond jewelry. Now, this might not have been so important if he hadn't been caught later that day with multiple mistresses, drunkenly rambling down the streets in his fine black robe with his nice silver sword. He was immediately identified, imprisoned, and sentenced to death, and unlike his other stays in jail, this would be his last. Though he would be executed, his legacy was already taking shape. Jack Shepherd's open defiance of Jonathan Wilde's criminal enterprise did a lot to change the public opinion of Wilde, along with the attempted murder which rendered him unable to manage his various schemes and businesses. The stranglehold Jonathan Wilde had on London took decades to establish, but only a few years to dismantle. By the time Jack Shepherd would face the gallows, Jonathan Wilde would be imprisoned and would face the same fate. His corruption was eventually revealed, his crimes investigated, and his guilt decided upon. These two characters are perfect foils. On one hand, you have Jonathan Wilde, a man who was born to impoverished parents in a blue-collar area, a man who built a prolific reputation for himself, a man who went from being a nobody to being one of London's most famous figures, a man who was hated by most because his entire life was built around cruelty and lies. On the other hand, you have Jack Shepherd, a man who was born to impoverished parents in a blue-collar area, a man who built a prolific reputation for himself, a man who went from being a nobody to being one of London's most famous figures, a man who was beloved by many because he was a man of the people. He laughed with them, drank with them, and gave them hope that someday they might be able to free themselves of the same poverty and vice. Their executions were both attended by thousands. In the case of Jonathan Wild, his attendees were glad to see him hang. In the case of Jack Shepherd, the streets were full of remembrance gatherings, and people were sad to see one of their heroes go too soon. In the end, Jack Shepherd took down London's very complicated vigilante. But it wasn't because he was Superman, or anything like that. The Jack Shepherd-Jonathan Wild rivalry is more akin to the Joker versus the Riddler, two villains fighting it out, one slightly more likable than the other. Nobody really won. Just because Shepherd was popular, his crimes aren't excused. The man was a professional criminal and made the lives of hundreds of people notably worse. Even in death, these two are somehow at odds. Jack Shepherd was immediately lodged in the immortal halls of the arts. He became a staple character for popular literature, a sort of modernized Robin Hood, while Jonathan Wild was treated like the first true crime boogeyman of the day. People wrote criminal biographies about him, which account for some of the first modern true crime literature. His body was even eventually exhumed and studied by a university's criminology department. Despite the situation's complex nature, the fine people of London could take solace in the fact that two criminals were off the street, even if it took a crook to catch a crook. Thank you for listening, everybody. I sincerely appreciate it. I hope that you enjoyed this little mini-series. I know that I enjoyed making it. This story is really, really fun and exciting, and I am kind of honestly shocked that I haven't seen a movie made about it yet. If you'd like to connect with me, remember this is a one-man show. I will definitely read whatever it is you say, and I'll probably respond as long as you're not, very mean or crazy. You can find me at Twitter at AllThePeoplePod, on Instagram at Obscure History Podcast, or you can write in directly to the email obscurehistorypod@gmail.com. Any of those are very good ways to get a hold of me. Special shout out to Simon on Twitter. It's been super fun getting to interact with them more and more, and I hope that more of you decide to reach out in the future. It makes the show even more fun to produce, which is good. I like when it's fun to produce. I'll be honest, some weeks I pick a story and it feels like maybe I've trapped myself in some sort of terrible situation because maybe it's even too obscure for me. But if I know that it's something that you guys are enjoying, or a subject that you're enjoying, or a series that you're invested in, it makes the research way more fulfilling. So let me know how you liked the series or what kind of content you'd like to hear next. I'm open to all suggestions. As always, this show is brought to you in part by Earbuds Podcast Collective and Indie Drop-In Network. If you need help finding your next favorite show, check the links in my show notes. I will link them. They will help you, I promise. Ariel and Greg are amazing people, and you should go check out their services. Until next week, thank you so much. Hey, if you are hearing this, then thank you so much. You are subscribed to the premium content. I appreciate it. Every little bit helps the show grow even more and more. So I am very sorry for missing episodes. I I'm going to try and figure out a better format for this. I am so bad at not having everything 100% scripted that I will avoid it at all costs. Sometimes it's just not conducive, like when it's a part 1, part 2 situation. I'm afraid that I'll give away secret information. But honestly, if you're an exclusive member, then maybe like you want a little bit of spoilers. I don't know. If you're hearing this and you subscribe to the premium content, then I guess let me know what you think. Do you mind spoilers? Would you like to maybe get some top secret information that might be in the upcoming week's episode? Let me know. If people don't mind spoilers, then I don't really actually mind putting a few here and there. So what I thought for today, because this story is so much like an action movie, I thought maybe I would cast the movie just the three main characters, because I think that there are three main characters in this story. You've got Jack Shephard, who is very small, talks with a stutter, very popular, very witty, and I think that the perfect casting position for that would be Tom Holland. I don't know if Tom Holland is actually small in real life, but in my imagination, he's small and he's very polite and charismatic, which makes me feel like he would be a shoo-in for the character of Jack Shephard. Now, the second character is a little trickier because Jonathan Wild is he's a little bit more complicated. He's just a smidge older than Jack Shephard was. Has to be somebody that can be sort of dignified one shot and then in the next scene be sort of very devious and villainous. And I don't know, this one's been a little bit tricky, but I think maybe Joaquin Phoenix. I don't know. I feel like he could really bounce back and forth between like reputable person in a courtroom and then like the next scene be like beating somebody up in the alleyway behind the courthouse. I feel like he could fill that role pretty well. Maybe get some solid special effects makeup in there to give him the Jonathan Wild's alleged facial deformation. We actually don't know for sure if he had some sort of facial anomaly or something. He's depicted as being very hideously ugly in almost a caricature-ish way. In my research, it seems that some historians think that maybe those were reflective of his character, not necessarily his actual looks, because Jack Shephard, who was very popular among the people, is depicted as being like angelically handsome, and that is also probably not true. But I don't know, a lot of people talked about how handsome he was, so maybe he really was like that handsome, and maybe Jonathan Wild was really that ugly, but I think there is a little editorializing in there. So our third and final position that we need our third and final role that I think we should fill is Elizabeth Lyon, because she pretty much every step of the way was Jack Shephard's sort of sidekick. His criminal muse, perhaps, is a good way to put it. So this one I think this one may be the hardest because we know the least about her. We know that she was sort of a street level sex worker, and that she was a well-known criminal for various things. She helped Jack Shephard with plenty of his thefts and burglaries, and shakedowns and all of the criminal things that they did. So somebody that can play kind of a really tough role. And I'm terrible because I don't watch television or movies because I work at work and then I work on this show. So I don't really watch a lot of movies. I'm usually either reading or writing or preparing lesson plans. But I think if you nailed me down to one, I'm going to say Kirsten Dunst. And I don't even know if she's acting anymore. Maybe she is. The last thing that I watched her in was probably like the first set of Spider-Man movies or something. But I think that she could play a sort of streetwise, but also like charismatic character, kind of like Jack Shephard. Like they have to have some sort of an amount of charisma because they were so well liked by the public, because even Elizabeth Lyon had a reputation as being sort of this well-liked kind of like well-intentioned criminal that steals from the rich and spares the poor sort of characters. And a lot of this comes from like, there is a massive amount of literature about Jack Shepherd after his death that came out that really, really glorified him as a folk hero, probably a lot more than he really was. So I think those are my 3 selections. I think that little bit of information about how I came up with those is interesting to me, at least. It's funny, you know, I have to decide on a narrative when I go into an episode, and I have to write to that narrative. It's really tricky to tell a cohesive story and then be like, well, actually, we don't even really know what his face looked like, but we suspect it because of these sort of reasonable assumptions. And like, I think it's interesting. I'm sure that you probably think it's interesting, but putting that into a cohesive story is very challenging, and also like most of the time takes you completely out of the story. And so that's never the goal, but I like to throw in tidbits here and there. There was actually, on the subject of Jack Shepherd literature, there was so much of it that came out after his death that plays with Jack Shepherd in the title were banned for a couple of decades because it was so popular, and he was so sort of turned into this weird working class martyr, even though he literally was stealing from the people that were like celebrating him. So kind of this weird dichotomy there, but it's more about the reputation than the actual man, I guess. Anyways, thank you so much for subscribing. I hope that this was enjoyable. Again, please tell me what kind of content you want for this bonus material. Writing extra stuff is very difficult. Going off of script makes me uncomfortable, but if either of those are what you like, I will work on getting those out more often. Thank you.